are now going to reconvene. I'd like to thank all the organizers, Paul Rich, of course, and the Grand Maitre of the Grand Orient de France, Georges Chérignac. It's not working very well, right? The sound, the volume is quite low. Okay. Closer to the microphone. It was working better this morning. Anyway, I'd like to thank the Grand Chapitre Général and French Rite, Philippe Guglielmi, and all the representatives of obediences, jurisdiction, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, dear speakers. Thank you for joining us for the second session of our first day. In a few minutes, we will be able to listen to Pierre-Yves Beaurepaire and then Stéphanie Roza. Pierre-Yves Beaurepaire, that I will introduce briefly. We should finish our session at 12:30, so I think we'll have to make our interventions concise. He's a professor of modern history at the University of Côte d'Azur. He wrote his thesis on the foreign Freemason in France and in the 18th century. He has written many books. I will only name some of them. He wrote a dictionary of Freemasonry, the Europe of Freemasonry in the 18th and 20th century, the Enlightenment and the World, an atlas of modern Europe, France and the Enlightenment, Europe and the Enlightenment in the Cosmopolitisme collection. He has just published a few days ago the Illuminati's secret society and the conspiracy theories. He's a member of the University Institute of France. You can find all his works in the Grand Orient de France magazine and the journal, the historical archives of the French Revolution. I'll just quote one of his works. The Universalism Republican from the Enlightenment to and the Freemason, and a sentence that I think will sum up his thinking, his arguments, before I give him the floor. Just one sentence long. Micro-society and transnational society. Masonic sociability allows individual development and universal development. So, Éric Beaurepaire, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers for having invited me. I'm quite chatty, and I know that we only have a limited amount of time. And to help out the interpreters as well, and without digressing too much from my written text, I'm going to read my text, which I disliked, but my text is about the Universal Republic of Freemasons, French Europe. I'm going to talk about cosmopolitanism and the culture of the Enlightenment. The principle of circulation, according to the historian Henri Tasseo's expression, the attention to the culture of mobility, owed to Daniel Roche, and the study of the communication process I've dedicated my work to, allowed me to place in perspective the model and the unique laboratory that Freemasonry offers to the Enlightenment, so that its thought and experience as a harmonious circulation space where the business mind, as we say in the 18th century, should take over the trade mind, the conquest mind, rather. It is a tight network of several thousand Masonic lodges, between 200 and 300,000 Freemasons. And the Universal Republic is giving a central place to international circulations. It's even requesting certificates in order to identify foreign Freemasons with who have been initiative, list of members, guides, of lodges per towns, maps, correspondences, mutual help. And I'd like to talk about some of the fascinating books written by Margaret Jacobs. As you know, she couldn't be with us today. She wrote in 1991 a book on the Enlightenment, and this has been a source of inspiration for me in the past 3 decades. Mobility that is both intense and regulated. Harmonious circulation are at the heart of the project and the practices of Freemasons. At the end of each assembly of lodges, brothers are feeling the symbol of a solid chain that is united Freemasons that are scattered around the 2 hemispheres. Feeling of belonging to a diaspora is an essential component of the Masonic identity. Cécile this morning talked about the importance of religious culture. It's an explanation to an acute attention to the means of communication, even when it's a long-distance communication between members, and the representation of the Masonic cosmos as a network, a tight network, an organized space, and where exchanges are rapid and confidential. Masonic sociability is not just about fulfillment in a fraternal sanctuary. Its goal is to be present all around the world, to create a universal republic of Freemasons as a free, harmonious, fraternal circulation, space of circulation. The Freemasons, during the Enlightenment, they are clearly placing their order and their project under the banner of cosmopolitism. It's part of their identity quests, and it's a way for brothers to reach fulfillment and to discover 2 worlds that are interlocked. They can choose, build this world, and they are going to be exemplary citizens of it. If cosmopolitanism is at the heart of Masonic thinking of the Enlightenment, it's because the founding myth of European Freemasonry is also the Tower of Babel. The loss of meaning, the lost word, the impossibility of communicating, of exchanging, sharing his knowledge. That's what brothers are dreading. The temple of the grand architect of the universe is Babel. Babel that is re-erected when the madness and pride of men had precipitated its downfall. Workers of the royal art want to erect a new Babel. There are works in the 18th century talking about universal languages that we can invent beyond Masonic circles. And these workers want to erect a new Babel, temple of accord, harmony, where communication between workers will be restored by practicing a true koine in Greek. The fact that we belong to one community. And this sign, tactile language allows 2 Freemasons to recognize each other as brothers. As any world utopia, the Universal Republic of Freemasons is aiming at recuperating this universal communication. The Marquis of Chef de Bien from the Masonic, this Marquis, the Masonic order is bringing together men and nations and is allow them to overcome prejudice, to open a space of dialogue and recognition. At the time, Europe is going through wars regular wars. And so this dimension of peace, exchanges, circulation has a real meaning, significant meaning. And to quote the first words written by Margaret Jacob on cosmopolitanism during the Enlightenment, nowhere in the world. The multitude of Masonic lodges that is scattered around due to individual initiatives, tourists, military, diplomats, traders, travels, is allowing this universal republic to enjoy different visual supports. But this diaspora is fragile. Contrary to other religious and intellectual diasporas at the time, the Masonic diaspora understood quite early on how vital communication was and how exchange of information in autonomous networks, recommendations, help are manifestations of solidarity and fraternity. We must insist on the fact that the pioneers of the Universal Republic are themselves Jacobites, such as Andrew Ramsay, disciple of Fénelon, and also Huguenots such as Vincent Lachapelle, Jacques Uriot, Louis-François de la Tierce. They are all figures, major Masonic figures, but also figures of other diasporas. They're part of other networks of solidarity in exile, but also an opening towards the hosting society. And Margaret Jacob has written a lot on Jean Rousset de Missy, and I think this could perfectly sum up my intervention. To implement this project of an autonomous circulation of information and establishing networks between Masonic obediences, Correspondence has become the backbone of this Masonic cosmos. Without them, without it, the meeting of scattered brothers on both hemispheres will only be an illusion. It is about trustworthy and regular correspondence that will allow us to share, to spread our fraternal union all around the world. Convinced of the importance of this epistolary trade in the economy of European Freemasonry, brothers have designed, spread networks of connections more and more numerous and complex. From the year 70-60, many general office of correspondences, true offices of correspondences were created, such as by the textile trader Jean-Baptiste Villarmoz in Lyon, or the Royal Treasurer Guard Charles-Pierre Paul Savalet of Lange in Paris. These strategies to roll out these networks are aiming at clearly controlling these spaces of concirculations, and more particularly its nodal centers such as crossroads, urban metropolitans. And that's the case for Strasbourg. That is the object of a constant rivalry between Villarmoz and Savalet de Lange. Correspondence becomes a political and geopolitical stake at the heart of the Universal Republic of Freemasons, and obediences are perceived both to be have perceived a threat on this liberated communication, and they're risking the loss of their credibility amongst Europe. We want to delimit zones of influence amongst one another. On the contrary, framed, instrumentalized correspondence, channeled epistolary flows are the best way to share this information between the central level and local lodges. Indeed, the Grand Orient designates lodges, names lodges that are part of its obedience by using the expression loge de sa correspondance. My last chapter. During the Enlightenment, correspondence becomes part of the space, and travels are animating it, mobilizing it in international circulations. exchanges of information are preparing, accompanying, and prolongating the meetings that was experienced during travels, but is not replacing it. This allows men from discovering each other, recognizing each other as brothers, welcoming visiting brothers, and more particularly foreign brothers, is of a capital importance. Freemasons are clearly aware that going abroad is essential, since it attests to the cohesion and the harmony of this fraternal micro-society that is the lodge. Indeed, this is a circle of elected, chosen friends, intimates who co-opted each other. They have familial relationships, professional, geographical relationship. On the contrary, a foreign Freemasons that is requesting hospitality with his brothers is coming out of nowhere. It represents the diaspora of scattered Freemasons among both hemispheres that we honor at the end of the Agape feast, but is confronting the lodge to the paradox of the sociability of the Enlightenment. The welcome given to foreign travelers qualifies the lodge both from its internal cohesion point of view and his cosmopolitan faith. 2,000 to 3,000 foreign Freemasons were welcome, which led Freemasons to building reception facilities adapted to the multiple expectations of travelers. So for instance, here, the L'Irlandaise du Soleil Levant, the Rising Sun Irish Lodge, was built for students, Irish medical students in Paris. And in these lodges that are frequented by masters and students, foreigners and tutors, governors in the 18th century, are organizing training tours that are becoming initiation tours without forgetting the approval tour. And it's clearly a way of entering the world, of starting in the realm of civility and good taste that Freemasonry is playing a role. So that's what I wanted to present to you today, and I'd like to thank the organizers again for inviting me.
Merci. Bon, j'ai essayé de faire court pour tenir les délais, parce que d'habitude...
I tried to respect the time that was given to me, and usually I would have been able to go for a lot longer, but I thought that I would stick to the time. Thank you very much, Pierre, for this very difficult exercise. I know that you didn't have that much time to sum up the paper that you had submitted, a paper that was very, very dense. Without further ado, let's move on to, is this better? Is the speaker closer to the microphone? Now let's listen to Stéphanie Roza. I will very quickly introduce her. She is a PhD. She has a PhD in political philosophy. She is a researcher at the CNRS, specialized in Republican and socialist revolutions for the 21st century and the Enlightenment. She's also worked on the philosophy of the French Revolution. She has published a book called How Has Utopia Become a Political Program? And she has just also, a few weeks ago, spoken about the enlightenment of the left, and this with the Sorbonne Publishing House. And 2 years ago, I believe it was 2 years ago, Stéphanie, yes? 2 years ago, a book that drummed up a lot of noise, Is the Left Against the Enlightenment? And it was Fayard who published this book. It was a book where she looks at the way in which a huge part of the French left wing has separated itself from its Enlightenment legacy. She defined 3 different categories to illustrate this heritage: rationalism, progressiveness, and also universality. And I will also maybe just give one quote saying that it came to be that during the recent period that lots of left-wing thinkers who thought themselves to be left-wing declared open war on the legacy and the heritage left by the Enlightenment period. This is coming from different intellectual periods that have had ravaging impacts on society as we know it. Stéphanie, without further ado, let me give you the floor so that you're able to speak about what is left of the culture of the Enlightenment. Good afternoon, everyone. I would also like to thank all of the different organisers for having invited me. I'm very sorry I had a little bit of an issue this morning, and therefore I'm going to be using my computer for this part of the presentation. What is left of the Enlightenment culture? I am maybe going to go into the different nuances that we have with regards to what was mentioned this morning. When we talk about the culture of enlightenment, we need to be very careful and heed with caution for several reasons. Why? Because what are we talking about here? Are we talking about a political culture, a philosophical culture, both of these at the same time? That's the first notion. And the second is that, generally speaking, there is no such thing as the culture of the Enlightenment. The fact that the Enlightenment movement was plural, with major disagreements and polemics on central subjects such as religion. We spoke about this morning actually, we mentioned the fact that there were debates on those looking at natural religion against atheism. I'm speaking about French Enlightenment here when it comes to atheism. We also have a lot of polemic in the 18th century within different Enlightenment philosophers. And within the Enlightenmentism movement, between good government, what is good government? Are we looking at a tempered monarchy? Are we looking at what we used to refer to in antique-style republic, a mixed government, so a hung government? This is a government inspired by the Roman government, the Roman democracy, which isn't free of all monarchist notions, or are we thinking about completely getting rid of the monarchy? These are the different types of debates that came to be during the French Revolution and French environment. And then we also have the economic question. We have notably, I'm speaking about France, obviously, but this is a debate that we've also seen between French Enlightenment and Scottish Enlightenment, the quarrel over sweet trade, which means that is trade something that is favourable to softening people, to bringing societies together, or should we think about commerce and trade as being a vector of trade, of commerce and of war? We also, for France, have the question about the monarchy, the government, and should there be regulations of the prices of commodities, for example, flour. We know that this debate was within the different great thinkers. Do we think that prices of commodities should be fixed by someone, by a higher being, or should we leave the market free to do whatever they like? And this led to lots of different discussions, especially the flour war between 1774 and 1775. What I would also like to say now is that we have a retrospective myth of the culture of the Enlightenment as being a unified culture, and this partly comes from the French Revolution. Why? Because it was a period where this culture became a lot more radical. It became even revolutionary, democratic, and egalitarian under the pressure of the popular masses. And we know that this was the case because of the revolution in France and this consistent pressure put on French society to look towards reforms, revolutions of French institutions. Despite all of this, when we talk about the culture of enlightenment, once we have really ironed out all of these creases that I've just mentioned, we can talk about a culture, because above and beyond just this debate, there are ways of thinking, there are common denominators, and I would say that the first of all of this that is important, and I come back to the presentation that was made this morning, it is how do we think against unquestioned authorities, against absolute monarchy, against religious institutions, traditions, the Pope, the Catholic Church, against the different traditions. The culture of the Enlightenment proclaims the inalienable right of critical. So I completely agree with what was said this morning. We're talking about a critical mind. How do you have a rational mind when dealing with these different issues? I spoke about this, about rational heritage. Politically speaking now, despite of all of the disagreements and the debates that I mentioned, this corresponds to the affirmation of individual rights that in the 18th century were called natural rights, and then from the French Revolution we started speaking about human rights. There is a difference, but obviously I don't have enough time to go into the details. but the fact that we have individual rights against established authorities. Once again, this is something that brought together, I imagine, all of the philosophers of the Enlightenment. And how do we move from individual rights to a tendency? And I'm talking about a tendency here, because in the 18th century, all of the different philosophers, we spoke about them this morning, all of the great thinkers, all of the Freemasons weren't against slavery. They weren't all favourable to the abolition of slavery. Therefore, when we think about individual rights and have tendency towards universality of these rights. And then, on a social level now, we also have, despite all of the different debates that I mentioned, we do have shared confidence in the capacity for individual and collective improvement and perfectionism, which we can talk about as being an optimism coming from the Enlightenment. We spoke about progressiveness being something that came out in the 19th century, but in the 18th century it was optimism. There was confidence to improve both on the collective and also on the individual front. And then from this culture of the Enlightenment came two major ideological families of the contemporary world. This is why, once again, we need to be very careful when we talk about the culture of the Enlightenment, because there are several different facets to this. We have a first tradition, this is liberalism, which is in line with the moderate Enlightenment, which was the majority in the 18th century, and also in the first period of the French Revolution, which is from 1789 to the 10th of August 1792, the fall of the monarchy. And this is a tendency that we saw coming back to the political sphere with the fall of Robespierre in the 19th century. We can see that there are different principles, for example, individual political rights being one of these, not necessarily social rights, but political rights, and also showcasing a representative parliamentary system with the government at the center of this, the defense of property rights, land rights, this in the light or on the eve of Joan of Arc, and adherence to the laws of the market, which are considered to be progressive. And then we have another political family that comes into play coming from the Enlightenment, and this brings together the various social currents coming from a more radical minority Enlightenment. I don't like using the word radical Enlightenment because Jonathan Israel spoke about this in the sense of social egalitarianism. Therefore, that's what I mean. I mean the fight against injustice and the idea that we should be equals. The political expression of this is rooted in the radical phase of the French Revolution, or when we're looking at the terror of the Jacobin government, and it's a tradition, a plural tradition. We've seen this come again at different times in history, but socialists tend to be in agreement with regards to giving social rights, not only political rights but also social rights, and also a tendency to favor attempts of direct democracy, or at least control of elected officials. This means that officials who have been elected by the people, for the people, to represent what they want. And we also have socialists who agree with the fact that there should be a limitation or even abolition of land rights by the public power. So this means that policy should be part of public power, but there shouldn't be too much political interference in the 19th century with the markets, which is why you had people suggesting that these property rights be abolished. I don't have a lot of time left, but I'm going to try and talk about the state of these two major families today and why this is the state of play. To begin with, the first thing I'd like to say is that with these two categories, we do have conservative criticism that is nothing new, because since its emergence, the culture of the Enlightenment has been under the attack of conservative critics. Conservative critics whose substance is, and this just very quickly in a nutshell, we're talking about the fact that individual rights, the principle of critical reason, critical thinking, raise illegitimate claims because they go against the traditional ways and beliefs of more traditional institutions, which means that individual rights and critical thinking actually go against the different barriers that you have in place for the people and against the people, and therefore all of the universal pretensions tend to be artificial and also unjust and fair. We can think about Burke and the reflections on the French Revolution in 1790s. This is from, once again, 1790. A couple of months after the Human Rights Declaration, Burke was raging, and therefore he wrote a book against human rights, saying that human rights are a violence to the social body and to humanity, because humanity is divided according to its different cultures and according to unchangeable political and social hierarchies. And this had been the case since the beginning of time. The men of the Enlightenment who were responsible for the French Revolution usurp divine power, and what they want to do is to completely remake the world in the image of their own fantasies, thus fighting against the social body and humanity. During the French Revolution, we have Joseph de Maitre, who also agrees with this, saying that man, the man of human rights, the human and human rights simply doesn't exist. It is an abstraction, and therefore we cannot legislate for all of humanity by denying the concrete reality that we face as humans. And from this first salvo of conservative criticism, a long tradition of political philosophical thought has emerged, the genealogy of which has been traced by certain 20th century intellectuals. We have a Marxist philosopher, Georges Lucas, who talks about the destruction of reason, very conservative criticism, talking about the French Revolution and idealism going right up until Nazism. And then closer to home we have Jeff Starnell, who is a historian, and he wrote a book called talking about the anti-enlightenment. I don't think you could be any clearer as a title for a book, anti-enlightenment. And this for these two books, the diagnosis is concordant. The anti-enlightenment tradition made extremely virulent by the French Revolution. It scandalized the whole of conservative Europe, and this will never cease until the Nazis, when you want to look at erasing, completely getting rid of what happened in 1789. Germany's particular place in this intellectual energy is due to the fact that Germany is a country that has suffered the most from the repercussions of the French Revolution, military invasions, Napoleonic institutions in the west of the country, and national construction in reverse mirror imaging of France. So it was symmetrical to what was going on in France. We have different conservative notions that we found in Germany because it was a complete mirror image of what we were seeing in France. This conservative critic continues to be present even now, and I would say that it's actually taken on new vigor in France. Why? Because at the time, in the previous stages, we used to have a part of the right that was monarchical and Catholic, and they gradually rallied to the Republic and its values. We also see the rise of politicians such as Eric Zemmour, an openly anti-enlightenment politician, is the most obvious sign of this, conservative critic that we're seeing, especially with youth in France. I move now to my second point. What is the internal criticism to the Enlightenment? As has been said, the culture of the Enlightenment has never been a homogeneous critique, and therefore its internal debates have never ceased, the most virulent of them opposing the representatives of the liberal Enlightenment to those of the radical Enlightenment and their heirs. For its part, liberalism has always been criticized by socialist tradition because of its inegalitarian consequences and also the blindness it has to the socio-economic problems caused by the economic market. These critiques are long-standing and, in a way, consubstantial with its history. This stream of criticism is far from having dried up, is now being deployed around different themes, limiting itself. Let me just quickly go around the different intellectual landscape. We've got equivalents in the Anglo-Saxon world as well. We have reproaches for the compromise with the colonial enterprise that have been mentioned. You've got John Locke, for example, in the United States, who criticized the French intellectual field a criticism that was also because they spoke about the fact that it was colonial enlightenment, and even earlier than this in history we have Mathieu Renaud, who spoke about the America of John Locke, and prior to this Dominique Losordo, the contre-histoire du libéralisme, so the counter-history, the counter-story of liberalism. In the same vein, we've also got liberalism that is criticized for its ultra-liberal neo-future, which for some was radical, and then also for its social Darwinism, which means that the fact that the ecological consequences of the economy of the market weren't taken into consideration, and also the use of the ecological crisis to foster further economic development. There is a book that was written about this. It's called La Grande Adaptation, The Great Adaptation. Romain Philippe wrote this, talking about the benefit of an even greater integration of populations and ecosystem into the capitalist market. As a left-wing critique, these critics question liberalism in the name of certain shared values, and this is why I speak about internal criticism. Liberalism is basically accused of not living up to its promises of equal political rights, property rights, which do not lead to general prosperity. Its system of political representation is not democratic. We can even look at the 19th century. For example, a representation of this critique can be found in Marx's Jewish Question, 1844, looking at a criticism of the political emancipation as not even that of 1844, but actually 1793, because he says that actually the emancipation is positive, but it is not the promised human emancipation. It does not go far enough. It is not strong enough. And in this reproach, we can also hear a second socialist critique of utopianism. Why? Because we're saying that the Human Rights Declaration of 1793 was a liberal or bourgeois utopia of a citizen who would pursue his personal goals in the private still, all the while adopting the point of view of the general interests in his civic life, that as a citizen of the modern state. And therefore, according to Marx, this duality becomes an insoluble contradiction, because you've got these two different facets of the same citizen within a bourgeois society that can only be resolved by having that overlap between the private and the public. And in all of these criticisms, there is a common point. There is a gap, there is a contradiction between the principles and the social effects of liberalism, which invite to correct some of the principles of liberalism, for example, property rights, economic freedom, so that the principles linked to individual liberty, social progresses are respected. In symmetry, the representatives of liberalism have never shied away from criticizing their egalitarian cousins, sometimes accusing them in terms of utopianism, so making unattainable promises, and sometimes also reproaching them for not respecting their own principles. This is a very long-standing criticism. We've got Benjamin Constant, de la liberté des anciens comparée à celle des modernes in 1819. And in this text, he says that egalitarians were looking to resuscitate ancient times, but that this would be completely impossible because it was a civic commitment that goes with it would be impractical for citizens of large political communities who are primarily interested in the private sphere and the pursuit of individual goals. Therefore, that was the first reproach. We're talking about a resurrecting the ancient city in a modern nation, and the two just can't go together because you're talking about a Jacobin government, and then you're trying to juxtapose something else on top of this, which just can't work. This criticism also was extended into the 20th century with a recurring reproach from the left to saying that the leftist sets principles that is quick to trample as soon as it is in power. A model of this kind of criticism was very important during the Cold War. For example, we have Jacob Talman, who wrote, he was an American, who wrote The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy in 1953, a great ideological retrospective since the 18th century, which shows how, from Rousseau to the leaders of the countries of real socialism, socialists are ready to sacrifice the political rights of individuals on the altar of economic egalitarianism. We have the liberals saying that socialists are giving privilege or giving priority to something that doesn't actually uphold their own principles. So we've got criticism, we've got internal debate, but as it currently stands, I think that we've actually entered a new phase in the last few decades where the Enlightenment cultures are facing new challenges. There are different reasons for this, but the first for me that I would like to mention this afternoon is the profound transformation of our world since the collapse of the USSR at the end of the 1980s, which divided the world into two great rival camps, both of which were claiming to have inherited a certain Enlightenment culture. We had a lot of debate around this, and this was between liberals and socialists, both claiming to be the heirs of this Enlightenment. As it currently stands, I think that we've got a completely different setup, and I'm going to speak about some of the major changes of our time. For example, on the one hand, we have large-scale international mobilities, migration, refugee crises that are really putting universalism of the Enlightenment to the test as never seen before. We've got the refugee crisis. We've also got unprecedented cohabitation between culturally different populations within the same society. And what does this mean? This means that universalism of the Enlightenment finds itself in the hot seat, being accused of utopianism, and also saying that this is something that is not suitable for the modern world. Why? Because we see that international migration, refugee crisis is something that is more problematic than anything else. We have a second source of crisis. We've got the climate crisis, which once again, in its own right, questions optimism inherited from the Enlightenment and the confidence in these technical progresses. And could we say that actually progressiveness or technology or different advances that have made, are they the cause of climate change and the climate crisis, the cause of catastrophe? We also have a third change that's important, and this for me is an enormous cultural and undoubtedly anthropological change brought about by the development of internet, social networks, social media, favoring a culture, and this is what we saw during COVID. It is a post-truth. What is happening to rationalism in such a context? Because anyone can post whatever they want on the internet. Everyone becomes a guru. We have fake news. We have questioning of scientific information as well. And this is rationalism that has been inherited from the Enlightenment that is now threatened. And then generally speaking, we've also got democratic crises in Western societies with a lot of abstention for the elections that are going to come up, being one of this. We also have people denouncing the health dictatorship in the name of ultra-liberal conception of individual rights. Others seem to be able to do without their democratic rights and vote for authoritarian candidates. And then you've got others who are completely indifferent to political life, political sphere, and being part of a democracy. And this is the democratic heritage that is in crisis. In addition to these objective challenges, and this will be the last part of my presentation, there is deep internal crisis, and this was actually what I was writing about, deep internal crisis on the left that is characterized and also feeds into the different aspects that I've mentioned. We have this deep internal crisis that is characterized, and I won't go into details with this because it is in my book, but I think that on an intellectual fashion, we're looking at paradoxical reinvestment of conservative arguments by part of the left. And this is something for me that is quite new. This means that we've got irrationalism, anti-progressivism, anti-universalism, and these were concepts that were very conservative, and now they're finding defenders on the left, as notably in certain degrowth theories, because especially when we're talking about anti-progressivism, and also certain neo-feminisms, decolonial or post-colonial anti-racism. And we can also go one step further and say that on the left wing, we also really have a rational side that it comes into play. This new intellectual configuration is both a symptom and an aggravating factor of the crisis of the Enlightenment culture, which means that it is something that feeds into the crisis, that feeds into ideological confusion, that for me is one of the characteristics of our time. To conclude, I have a question. What is the possible outcome of this crisis? there are different challenges that I've mentioned. They are immense, and I don't think that I have all the answers, all the solutions to this crisis today, but in my opinion, I think that the crisis will depend on the outcome of the crisis will depend on the ability of liberal and social heirs of the Enlightenment culture to meet the challenges of our day and age, which means that I think that we're not looking at a situation anymore where we should be claiming the Enlightenment culture and making it our own. We need to go one step further. We need to confront it with the different issues that we're facing, and we also want to make it evolve so that we can regenerate it, so that we can find the concrete answers to the crises of our time. This, for me, would be the path to follow, and I will leave you on that note. Thank you very much for listening.
Bien, merci.
Thank you very much, Stéphanie de Rosa. Thank you very much for having respected the time that was allocated to you. 10 minutes or 15 minutes just for any questions for our two speakers if you wish. There is a roving microphone in the room, and then we will break for lunch. Stéphanie, Rosa, sorry I got her name wrong, so I just put them together, and Pierre-Yves Beaurepaire will be here to answer any questions that you may have. Do you have any questions in the room?
Monsieur, est-ce que... voilà, merci de lui apporter un micro. Vous avez des micros.
Pas une question, mais...
It's not a question, but a clarification regarding Joseph de Maistre. Stéphanie Rosa probably knows him. He was a Freemason and wrote a treaty on the order of Freemasons, which is quite humbling. Other comments? Questions? Thank you. A question addressed to both speakers. In your presentations, the ideas coming from these thinkers, were they were put to an experimentation, or was it just conceptual? I know that books on sociology were written. Are there similar examples in Freemasonry and lodges? It's a question that is addressed to both speakers. It's not an easy question. I'd say that in Tuscany, after 1737 and with the Habsburg-Lorraine, because it was a real laboratory of reformers in the police sector. We were talking about the seeds markets, the flower war in 1775. They were working on this, and they were reading different works so that they could also contest them. So I think there could be an example at that time. There were also reflections on education, censorship, in certain of the lodges in Vienna in the 18th century. But I don't think it's representative. I think it's quite punctual, it's quite sporadic, and I don't think it's a representation of the Masonic practice in the 18th century. But yes, there were probably attempts to implement this. Stéphanie, would you have an answer? I guess that this question is less addressed to me because the liberal socialist tradition had been at the head of governments, revolutions, and it starts in the 18th century. It talks about the flower war, and why controversy is inherent to the Enlightenment and is as acute, because the price of seeds is due to the Turgo ministry. So part of the Enlightenment is liberal, meaning that prices mustn't be capped anymore as it was in France. So we make this experience. We stop capping prices. What happens is that prices are increasing and riots are happening. Peasants are going on markets and are making merchants buy their seeds at a price that they estimate are the right price for their livelihood. So this what triggers debates amongst during the Enlightenment. Does it mean that it wasn't radical enough and that's why it failed, or are there other reasons to this failure? In history, and what's interesting with Turgot reforms is that there is a liberal dimension, but there can also be an authoritarian dimension. When we say that because it's a good reform, then it is a conspiracy against me, and he will ask Le Noir, who was in charge of this for the king, to stop being in function. And the economy is a central issue at the time, and everyone intervenes, has an opinion, and there are very interesting writings on this, on land ownership as well. Other questions? Concise and brief questions. Thank you. A question. The presentation was very interesting, but I have a question. What should we do today? What can we potentially do as Freemasons to make sure that the Enlightenment are being strengthened, alive again? Another hand at the back of the room. Good morning, thank you. And to complete what has been asked, we are in the middle of confusion, so isn't it the time for universal Freemasonry to take stock of what failed with the liberals, failed with social left-wing parties, and in France some Freemasons are making it even more confusing. We see that the CRIF is now part of the political background. More and more confusions, divisions in the French society, including amongst Freemasons, and I think that we need to take some time to sort what's worked and what hasn't worked, if we can, and then see what can be brought back to life. Or rather, that's too strong of a term, but how can we find an inspiration again in the values of the Enlightenment? Other questions? To complete what has been said, just to be provocative, should we make a Netflix series on Freemasonry, which will make Freemasons more visible around the world, and that would be relatable for everyone? Let's stop here regarding questions. Okay. 3 questions, 2 answers. Well, I'm not a Freemason, so I'm not going to teach Freemasons what to do. I'm a bit embarrassed by this, but generally speaking, I think that if you feel that you carry the heritage of the Enlightenment, that if you think that you relate to their values, then you should contribute to the reflections on the main challenges of our time. So, for instance, what are the good or bad use of the internet, of social networks, political use as well? What can we face the climate change challenge? What type of progressism should we enforce in the 20th century? What about technical progress? I think technical progress can help us solving the climate crisis, but we need to think about these issues. How can we face those challenges? Populations who are living in regions of the world where radical right is rising, that is threatening the republic. So yes, if you're a citizen and you are the heritage of the Enlightenment is dear to your heart, then you should be part of a collective debate. No specific answer. Right, so let's close this first half day, and we'll be back at 2 o'clock for the rest of our interventions. Thank you very much, and bon appétit.